Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. This event is a webinar for nonprofit leaders, professionals, and engaged donors. I am Stacy Steele, Director of Marketing and Communications at Charity Navigator, and I will be moderating today's event. There are about 1,700 registrants on today's webinar, and we are so glad to have you here. The goal of this event is to engage the nonprofit community in a conversation around how rating on impact and a general shift towards broader assessment of nonprofit effectiveness can support nonprofits in showcasing successes, recruiting new donors, and weathering the current challenges facing the nonprofit community. We want to combine practical information for nonprofits on how to improve the ability to effectively present the amount of good achieved with donations received. Among nonprofit raters and donors alike, impact has earned notoriety as the Holy Grail. This discussion lines up with a general shift towards data-driven giving and a more holistic assessment of nonprofit effectiveness to supplement Charity Navigator's historic reliance on financial data. We will dive into the Charity Navigator's Impact and Results Beacon that was released last month, as well as discuss broader issues around impact and fundraising. And now to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Kanika Bahl, CEO of Evidence Action, an international nonprofit focused on measurably reducing the burden of poverty for hundreds of millions of people. Second, we have Elijah Goldberg. Elijah is the Vice President of Impact Ratings at Charity Navigator. He previously led Impact Matters, which was acquired by Charity Navigator this year to create impact ratings. Next, we have Stephen Rockwell. Stephen is the Chief Rating Technology Officer at Charity Navigator. And last, but certainly not least, we have Victoria Vrana, Deputy Director, Policy, Systems, and Giving by All at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome. We are hoping for a free-flowing conversation about the future of the sector and the role that data will play with multiple perspectives represented. This event today will run for an hour through 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will save 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the discussion for audience questions. Throughout the event, please share your reflections and engage with others on Twitter using the hashtag #ImpactGiving. During the event today, you'll also be asked to participate in a poll. We will share the responses before we close. As we release the poll, which you will see on your screen, we ask that you take a minute to answer the questions. Finally, throughout the event, please submit your questions for the panelists. We will collect them, aggregate, and ask a few at the end of the discussion. So before we get started with our panelists, I'd like to share something with our audience. Prior to today's event, we launched a poll on Twitter. We posed the question to nonprofits. How well are you currently able to communicate impact to your donors and supporters? Here are the results. 40% said not well. 46.7% said moderately well, and only 13.3% said well. We hope that this helps provide some insight on how some nonprofits are currently articulating their impact. Okay, so I'd like to launch our discussion with Victoria. So Victoria, many donors have historically focused on how much of their donation is going towards the cause, instead of what their money will accomplish. So tell us, why is it important to factor impact into philanthropic decision making? And furthermore, what shifts in donor preferences and behaviors have you seen?
First, let me say thank you so much, Stacy, and to Charity Navigator for having me. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'm thrilled that there's like hundreds of other people who want to talk about this today. I feel in very good company, including with my my fellow panelists. So, you know, first and foremost, I believe that measuring and tracking impact is most important for nonprofit leaders, not for the donors. That more than anyone, leaders need to know how their programs are doing. They shouldn't be able to sleep at night if they don't know how their programs are doing. They need to know if they're making a difference, and they need to be able to get the data and the feedback to improve their programs continuously, because we know impact isn't a straight shot, especially when we're talking about human beings or climate. Leaders really have to understand the true cost of their work and the return on their investment and the return on dollars and the return on their efforts. Donors should really be next in line after the people that are served. The challenge is, and your poll really showed this, there's this huge gap. It's like a Grand Canyon between what nonprofits are measuring for themselves, if they're able to measure it for themselves. It's hard to do, right? And funders don't fund the capacity to do it, which makes it even harder. But then there's this enormous gap to translate that to donors. There are roadblocks in the way. Like imagine the Grand Canyon and there are like alligators or dinosaurs or something down there, like getting the impact over to the donors, because donors want it to be simple. They want it to be quick. They want it to be easy. They want it to be standardized. They want it to be, you know, there at the moment they're making the decision. And the challenge with that, again, that nonprofits leaders know, there's incredible nuance in measuring impact. Right, that arc of history that we hope is bending towards justice, it's not a straight shot. And so if you're sharing impact at a moment in time, the donor wants to know, how are you doing this very second as I make this donation? You may not be able to do that well. So it complicates it incredibly for the nonprofits who are doing this work. And I know my fellow panelists will get into some of those challenges even more. So let me say why it's worth doing. Like, despite the alligators and the dinosaurs, we know that donors want information on results and effectiveness. Study after study shows that they want it. Now, what the studies often say is they don't know where to find it. They care about impact, but they don't see it. They're not getting a feedback loop closed. So donors make a donation, maybe they hear something about impact. They don't hear about impact later. They don't hear how their gift helped contributed to the impact. So we know that it can move money. There are a bunch of different studies, right? There's a Black Box study from 2018 that shows 70% of young donors in particular, want efficiency information. 56% want information on impact. We hear over and over again from donor advice funds. So think of donors with more resources. They particularly want to see impact. So it's worth doing. I just want to really acknowledge how hard it is to do and how the donors should be secondary. You know, they can feel primary in this, but they should get what you're measuring for yourself. The other thing I want to say about this is we also don't know enough about how donors use impact data and what the barriers are. And there was this great study that just came out from Oxford back in like August, where someone looked and they did a systemic review of 700 reports, 700 different studies, trying to look at like how donors use this data and whether or not they use this data. They only found 9 of the 700 had any valid results. So basically, like, we don't know that much about what's in the way of donors using this information. The couple things they know are like, it's hard to access evidence. Donors can't understand evidence. You know, it doesn't give you a lot to work with. So there's a lot of room to better understand this connection between evidence and results and donors and how it changes donor behavior.
That's great. Does anyone have any comments, Kanika, from your perspective?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking that I think the other reason that implementers, Victoria referenced some of the reasons why implementers might be reluctant or not see the appetite or how to engage with donors on evidence. I actually think as well, there is this fear as an implementer you have about what happens if I measure my program and it doesn't work. And so, as I was thinking about this panel, I thought, well, I can share all these great examples of programs we have where the impact is held, but I also think it's really important to acknowledge when it doesn't and what happens. And so, just to share, I think this was really a very powerful example for me. We had a program at Evidence Action called No Lean Season, which was based on promising RCT evidence, which is commonly considered a gold standard of evidence and impact. And it was a seasonal migration program in Bangladesh. And the idea was basically that you gave poor farmers loans. They migrated to the city during the hungry season when there wasn't much work in the rural areas. And they earned $5 for every single program dollar spent. And it was kind of celebrated. We'd received coverage in The Economist and NPR. Donors gave us millions of dollars. It was recognized by well-run rating agencies, and then we scaled it. And then when we tested again, because we tested scale in 2017, we saw the original impact wasn't holding. And so implementation was working, farmers were taking out the loans, but they weren't migrating. They weren't seeing the types of increased income. And so there's a lot of nuances to that story, but I just want to share that, I saw that evidence and I remember being terrified about how the donors would react and yet feeling like the right thing to do, as Victoria said, this is ultimately about the beneficiaries. The right thing to do was to end the program and to be very transparent about those results. And that's what we did. And I just offer that because I think I was shocked at how many of our donors reacted. Instead of being upset that we'd ended the program given the lack of efficacy, our major funders actually thanked us for their transparency, and for the most part asked that we repurpose it to other programs, which meant we could shift millions to programs like deworming, where for every $1 we could reach 2 children. And so I just want to say that I think we're still early in this shift in donor behavior from causes to results and impact, but I just think that there is increasing signs that if you can bring rigorous evidence and impact and transparency to bear, donors can and will come along.
Interesting. So just switching gears just slightly. So let's talk a little bit, dive a little bit deeper. Assessing an organization's impact has historically been very challenging, as we've made clear. So especially across cause areas and different models. How has the sector evolved to make rating impact easier or more accessible? Stephen, would you like to start off?
Sure, happy to. First, I'm glad we're acknowledging how tough this stuff is. We know it is, especially for smaller organizations that don't have the resources for program monitoring and evaluation staff or tools. And so I think it's really helpful at the front end to just say, we all know we're in this together and we all know how difficult this is. And we also know, I come from a technology background, that the tooling is vastly, there's been tons of investments on the fundraising side of our operations and not nearly the same investment. We're only now starting to see this significant investments on the program impact side of the house to make this work easier. There's lots of promising efforts that we can talk about those later, but just to note that even sort of where we've placed our time and energy collectively in investment, I think on the tooling we've got some disparity. Let me just open though with a little bit of a personal story about how much or perhaps how little we've evolved our practice here. 20 years ago, my first job after AmeriCorps, I was at a United Way. I saw there were a number of folks on the call today representing the United Way system and many more organizations that probably receive investment from United Way. I was involved in those investment decisions, and much to my dismay, none of my training around policy analysis in college was relevant. We weren't doing any real evaluation of social cost benefit analysis, no regression analysis on the impact of a program, no random control studies, none of that, right? And it was so disappointing to me. I was a little green, I guess, at the time, that we weren't doing any of those things, and it was very sort of historical based funding. Despite my disappointment, we were doing some other really important pieces of the work. We were training nonprofit staff in logic models and beginning to expect to see both outputs and outcomes in agency reporting. And we were one of the first United Ways in Philadelphia to launch the community impact agenda setting, where we're working cross-sectoral with stakeholders to come up with system-wide targets for progress. And in some ways, the MDGs and SDGs are similar efforts that we've seen over the last 20 years of setting these system-wide targets, and for the rest of us to figure out how can we impact that overall goal. That's a development I think is really welcome. You know, and these steps in the United Way system, and probably lots of folks on the call that you've all taken over the last 20 years, are a really important part of the sort of arc of progress on this issue. And I think the question is are we making enough progress fast enough? And we'd love to hear from folks. You know, we're doing the hashtag impact giving. If you want to @CharityNav, you want to me, Stephen Rockwell on Twitter, I'd love to hear comments. You can also put some of that in the chat. You know, are we making the progress fast enough, and what would help that progress, right? And so, likewise, directionally for Charity Navigator, we've been on a 20-year journey. And up until we launched the Encompass rating system in July of this year, our rating solely focused on finance and accountability and transparency measures in our STAR rating system. In some ways, you can understand that. It's the most straightforward thing to measure, right? It's machine readable from the 990. Your liabilities to asset ratio is what it is. You either have a donor privacy policy or you don't. These are very straightforward things. But the Encompass rating system intends to look at 4 broad domains of organizational efficacy that get beyond that, including finance and accountability, but also impact and results, community and culture, leadership and adaptability. We know the impact and results data is a lot more nuanced than a form on a 990, right? The Form 990. For the last couple of years, we've experimented with partners like Classy, Candid, Global Giving, and Impact Matters to include program impact data and results on the nonprofit profile pages of the site. And so that was another step we took in this journey. And, you know, I think that approach is emblematic of how we want to continue the journey. We have a strong desire to work with the sector to not recreate the wheel, and to not create an extra set of work for nonprofit organizations to get an evaluation from us. It's really important to me. I know that we're all stretched, and to ask for yet another set of reporting from another group is in some cases a bridge too far. On that latter point, we're going to continue to work with data partners, monitoring evaluation tools to automate as much as we can. And then on the methodology front, we acquired the wheel, or at least one of the wheels, right? Instead of recreating it. And I'm really excited that that this webinar that we're in is part of the announcement process of the acquisition of Impact Matters, which we launched a month ago, with the impact and results begin within the Encompass rating system, leveraging the Impact Matters methodology and data. We're excited to welcome the IM team of experts, advisors like Dean Carlin, Michael Weinstein, and our new staff colleagues, Elijah Goldberg, Tamsin Chen, and Masha Winchell. And I'm now going to turn it over to my awesome new colleague, Elijah.
Great. That's great. So Elijah, you want to talk to us a little bit about growth?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks, Stephen. I'm very excited to be part of the Charity Navigator team. I will just say, not to shill, I'm shilling for my own organization, but it's a phenomenal group of people, and it's been a very fun transition. I think, Victoria and Stephen both talked a little bit about some of the history, some of the trends that have led us to where we are today. I think one in particular is really worth pulling out, which is that it's sort of underappreciated in the sector, in the field of evaluation. But what we've seen over the last hundreds of years is a really steep decline in the cost of data collection, data storage, data analysis, and data sharing. So the sort of things that we can do just like on our laptops right now are things that would take a research team weeks, if not months to do, if not be impossible to do, even like a couple of decades ago. And so I think a lot of what we've seen in the growth of evaluation is there's definitely lots of factors that are causing it, but certainly one of the big ones is that it's so much more accessible. And I think that what we've done at Impact Matters, and where I think we'll take a very small sliver of the credit for kind of moving things forward, is that to date, typically we've seen two separate worlds. So on the one side, we've seen the academic world. This is where started back with John Snow in the 1850s, looking at cholera deaths. Like, it's been a very long arc of improvement in methods and expansion of studies across different fields, geographies, and so forth. And a lot of that work is ongoing, and it's very high quality. On the other hand, you have nonprofits, and nonprofits are sometimes connected to the academic world, but are often not. They're often working in a completely different context, and they're often asked to collect data to prove their efficacy, something that would take a PhD 3 or 4 years to do with a research budget, right? I mean, it's a difficult task to take a novel program and say with a degree of certainty that it's effective. And so what I think we've made our task is to see if we can bring together those two worlds a little bit. Can we take the methods that academia has built, but can we adapt them in such a way, and honestly, most of the time that's watering them down, but can we adapt them in such a way that they are usable by nonprofits who, for whom the production of knowledge is not the first order priority. It has to be, maybe it has to be done, maybe it should be done, but it's not why they're there. And so I think we've done it in different ways in terms of sort of, expanding beyond using just formal evaluations, but using monitoring data, using things like program types to streamline the development of methodology, systematizing different steps. So we've done that, we'll continue to do that. And I think that that's in some ways, the exciting part of the next few years is to see whether, by kind of increasingly bringing those two together, we can get to a point where a huge proportion of service delivery nonprofits, at least, are quote ratable. We can understand the impact of the work that they do.
That's terrific. This is really fascinating. I think for not just large organizations, but smaller ones, where they're kind of thinking, is this like a mountain that I'll have to surmount, and how can we do it realistically? Before we go on to the next question, what I'd like to do is and I mentioned earlier during my introduction, is that we would be conducting a poll. So it's now that time. I would like everyone to kind of take a look. The poll question will be, nonprofit professionals, how do you currently showcase your impact to potential and current donors? One option, storytelling, marketing, reporting data through 990s, one-on-one conversations, you don't currently showcase impact, or if there is something else that you do. And we're going to take about 30 to 60 seconds just to go through that poll. You should see it on your screen. We'd like a few more of you to jump into the poll. We'll give you another moment. Okay, great. Let's move on. Let's talk about the steps. So what steps can nonprofits take to better measure and select their impact? How can nonprofits leverage their impact scores to better tell their stories and raise funds? Elijah?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's tough to do this in 3 or 4 minutes. There's there's some meaty issues here. Although one key takeaway to start with is that I think often this sort of work is viewed as complex, and there are some aspects of it that are a little complex, or at least there's a lot of information. But I actually think it's a lot simpler than its reputation, and sometimes it can be like unnecessarily intimidating, I guess is the point. So I guess my point there being, if you are working on impact analysis, impact measurement, whatever, and you find yourself like very confused, something's like very complicated, it might be the fault of the thing you're reading and not you. People tend to make this a lot more complex sometimes than it needs to be, and it's worth stepping back and examining that. I will say though, kind of at a very broad level, we basically need to know 3 different things to be able to understand the impact of a program. And when I say impact, I mean the effect that some set of activities have on some group of beneficiaries on something that we care about. So it might be, distributing water filters. How does that lead to clean water access for this particular population, or the like? So the 3 things we need to know are, how are outcomes changing over time for those beneficiaries, for the participants? What is the counterfactual change, which means what would have happened otherwise? And what is the cost to achieve those changes? So we'll go through them quickly. So with outcomes, outcomes is a very loaded word, has lots of different definitions. It's very broad, it's very narrow. Really, we're trying to find a sweet spot between 2 things. What is feasible to measure, and what is actually capturing important change. And so there's lots of things that are feasible to measure, like, I don't know, social media traction, that may not be capturing important change, or it might be if you're an advocacy group. But let's say that you're a soup kitchen, that's probably not an important measure to track, even to track. And similarly, there may be things that we want to know, but that are very, very difficult to find out, very expensive to find out, will take years, and often it's just not worth bothering. That's always a judgment call, but you can certainly easily overinvest in evaluation that's not going to actually change behavior either internally or externally. So we want to select an outcome. Usually it'll be short term, probably should be short term, unless there's a good reason not to be. And then just track that for participants. Pretty straightforward. Counterfactual is basically what would have happened with those same participants on that outcome if you hadn't been intervening, if you hadn't been working with them. This is an important concept to capture, because often when we say, okay, our participants started the program and they had 1,000 in monthly income, they ended, they had 1,500, we take credit for that entire $500 increase. But the reality is that people get better on their own. They can advocate for themselves, they can get jobs, they can improve their circumstances. They can also get worse on their own, unfortunately. But if we claim credit for everything that changes over the course of a program in a person's life, we're almost certainly going to be over crediting ourselves with impact. So counterfactual is difficult. That's why we spend money on expensive studies. The easiest way to do it is either to look for like a nice comparison, like how people who are similar but not on the program fare, or look at there's a lot of government data out there that can be found, or to just take a guess. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. And then third is cost. So we typically focus in on the program cost, so exactly the dollars that are being spent to achieve that particular outcome. Not looking at things like overhead or other sort of fixed costs, because really what we're trying to figure out is, the key question is, if we're going to put another dollar into this program, what are we likely going to see in terms of impact? What's the next the next choice that we're making? We're not hiring another executive director, so we don't have to worry about that cost. But if we have to hire another program director, what are we expecting to see in terms of changes? And so we can put those together. We can buy impact by cost. We can get something like an impact statement, something like 50 cents leads to clean water access for a person for a year. I will say, I will point people to impact.charitynavigator.org. I'll probably make 2 or 3 more shills for that. That's where we're collecting kind of structured data from nonprofits to create impact ratings. There's a lot of other resources out there. The final thing I'll just say on the question of stories, Victoria kind of brought this up earlier. I don't know if there's much to add, but But I will just say there is evidence out there. I think there's increasing evidence out there that the right presentation of impact data can increase funding. It's not a guarantee. It's not like you just slap some impact data or slap something that says impact and it works. There's definitely studies that go both ways. Framing is really important, yada, yada, yada. But it does seem like there's a case to be made, not just from the kind of internal decision-making standpoint, which I think I agree is the most important reason, but also from the just return on investment in terms of investing in this and getting more donations.
So we'll go into evidence, get a little bit deeper into this, just in case anyone missed that link that we are encouraging you to reference regarding impact. It's impact.charitynavigator.org. Okay, so let's get back to evidence and decision making. So Kanika, Evidence Action is renowned for its focus on evidence-based decision making. How has this affected the impact Evidence Action has been able to make for its beneficiaries? How has it affected really your fundraising work?
Yeah, absolutely. And before, thank you for giving me the opportunity to brag about our programs. That's always welcome. But before I go into that, just one thing I wanted to pick up on that I think every panelist has said in one way, which is that I think simplicity of measurement is really critical. And that's what something that Elijah was saying, and Victoria in a different way, which is that it should be actionable for your programs. And I just think that's such an important theme. If you have 50 indicators, you're probably going to use none of them. If you have 3 or 4 that are really core to your program that you use to continuously improve the program, that's going to be powerful for you, for your beneficiaries, for your programs, and ultimately for the donors as well. So in any case, before going into Evidence Action, I just want to pick up on that. But yeah, in terms of the focus on impact, I think what it's meant for Evidence Action is that, you know, for every dollar we spend, we're able to maximize our impact for those that we serve. So the impact of that can be really profound. With our clean water program, it can mean saving a young child's life in rural Malawi or Uganda or Kenya. With our deworming program, it can mean improving a child's prospects for lifelong income. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Evidence Action, we use evidence of impact through a program cycle. So we'll usually, our program selection starts based on rigorous studies. Several of our programs were based on the work of Nobel Prize winning economists, but then we continue doing rigorous monitoring through the program cycle. And then, you know, Stacy, to your specific question, I'd like to talk about 2 different programs and then compare and contrast the quite different experience we've had with fundraising for them. For deworming program, we based our program on evidence showing that deworming a child, which costs less than 50 cents per treatment, can increase lifelong income. There was a recent study that showed that for every $1 spent on deworming, individuals earned average economic benefits worth over $230. So given that evidence of impact, we focused on rapid deworming, which we did in partnership with governments across Africa and Asia. And it's allowed us to deworm hundreds of millions of children globally. One example, with our support, the government of India grew from reaching less than 30 million children in 2014 with deworming medications to over 250 million in 2019. And the programs we support actually account for 1/3 of the total number of children at risk for parasitic worm infections globally. So what that means is that, you know, hundreds of millions of children have potentially, or millions have better life prospects. And I'll come to the fundraising for that in a moment. A second program is a clean water program, which reaches 4 million people. That's dispensers for safe water. And that operates in the most rural parts of Kenya, Malawi, and Uganda. Here again, the program was unique. So studies found that placing dispensers next to rural water sources was very convenient, it was very salient, and it meant that the usage rates were 5 times that of comparable water quality interventions. However, even once we started with that evidence, we didn't stop. We continued measuring and improving the program so that we can maximize impact. So today, the program has really high usage rates, and is incredibly inexpensive. That sort of dollar per impact point that Elijah was making. It costs below a penny a day for every user. It's also an extraordinarily effective way to prevent diarrhea, which is the second largest killer of children. And last year alone, we prevented over, an estimated 450,000 cases of illness. But I want to be really transparent that all this focus on impact and value for money hasn't consistently translated to funding. With deworming, we were very fortunate with the impact. It's been adopted by a community of philanthropists, sometimes known as effective altruists, who've sustained the program at large scale. But beyond this, it hasn't attracted a great deal of reliable funding from more mainstream donors. And then Dispensers for Safe Water, which is, I have to say, a program which is very close to my heart, has been incredibly difficult to sustain from a funding standpoint. Clean water as a cause just isn't on strategy for a lot of donors. We've benefited from a niche of donors focused on impact who we've been able to identify, but it hasn't been easy. And so I say that because I think this is why, like Victoria, I'm so excited that hundreds of people are interested in this topic. I'm incredibly excited that Charity Navigator is focusing on impact, because I think it's going to allow an ability to give visibility and impact to a more mainstream audience. And it's the start of a more active movement and focus going forward.
That's great. I wish we could dive deeper into why it's so difficult for funding. But we just don't have the time, but it's a bit disheartening to hear that from you. So
Stacy, can I jump in with can I jump in with one point on that to follow up? So
sure.
I think what's so important about this is that, with donors, you've got to appeal to the head and the heart, right? And I don't know if you guys can see this. You see that poster? It says, follow your heart, but take your brain with you, okay? And so I keep that next to my desk, obviously. It's for my teenagers, and it's like the theme of our everyday giving program, because donors are going to lead with their heart, right? You've got to hook them on the cause. You've got to hook them on whatever. But then we need the brain, I think, ultimately will help donors choose between organizations, right? Once you care about water, you want the one that's doing the best. And to follow up on something Elijah said, right now there's not enough of supply of impact data to donors for us to know how much it matters. We have hints, we have guesses, we have those 9 studies, but I can assure you that as that supply increases, and as it scales to be in more places that donors are going to be, there'll be a really clear differentiator between organizations that have the heart and the head and those that just have the heart. And so it's important. We're just at the beginning of this, but it's important to have both, but you can't forget the brain piece. We're going to need it down the road.
Point well taken. So I want to throw something out to all of the panelists. The question is, what have you learned about nonprofits through the work of understanding their impact? So obviously for Kanika, you're at a nonprofit where you've just talked about impact. Victoria, you're actually part of the funding for nonprofits. So again, what have you learned about nonprofits through the work of understanding their impact? Victoria, would you like to start off?
Yeah, I can just say, like Kanika's story and her first point about donors responding well to them shutting down a program. We fund a lot of experimentation and a lot of innovation. And so when I have a grantee who runs an experiment over 3 months or 12 months or 18 months, and they come back and they go, it didn't quite work as we thought, and actually this was kind of disappointing, this wasn't statistically significant, my trust in that grantee increases, right? They're transparent, they're learning, they're honest, they're sharing the real data with me. When I get a grantee that comes back and like everything increased 1,000%, it was all amazing, and you just have to kind of wonder about that and really look at the data. So as a funder, I do think the more honest and transparent nonprofits are. Where it gets tricky again is for those donors who are making those decisions in an instant, and for an everyday donor. And how do you kind of get them to go along a longitudinal journey? But for institutional funders and high net worth funders, I think that transparency is even more important than the results, and the skill and the commitment to measuring. That you show how you're measuring, you know what those outcomes are that Elijah was talking about, you know how to measure, and you know what you're trying to measure and why.
If I could build off of Victoria's point, I think part of the way we're building the Encompass rating system is to meet the donors where they're at, and ideally over time bring them along, right? So we know, for example, that we lose about 20% of our web traffic on search results. That means that people are looking for the organization, they're looking for a rating, they're confirming, yes, this is a well-rated organization, and then they're leaving, right? And so it's just that top level score. That's what I've been sort of saying, nibble, bite, full meal. A lot of donors are like looking for that nibble, and so as a consumer brand, we're providing that to them. Ideally, we're bringing larger and larger sets of donors though on a little bit more of a journey, and maybe this is the heart to head piece of this, which is the bite is to get a level deeper. What composes that overall rating? Can I what's more important to me? Is the impact? Is it finances? What are the aspects that are driving my donor decision making on this? And then through the site, we also want to provide the full meal, the nibble, bite, full meal, and get into the details of, and we know we've got some donors that are really highly engaged and want to, we have some major donors that use Charity Navigator, and their spreadsheets are much more complicated than our own in terms of the types of evaluations they're doing on the organizations they care a lot about and that they give to. Now, granted, a lot of those are financial, so to the degree that we can, as you're saying, Victoria, start providing a lot better impact data, we'd love to see them on the highly engaged donor spreadsheets as well.
Anyone have any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, I would add something a little different tangent. There's something that I like to call the ineffectiveness myth. So I think we all know what the overhead myth is, or have heard about it. This idea that financial ratios are indicative of impact or something about a nonprofit, and it turns out that that's not true. I think there's also an ineffectiveness myth that's pervasive in the sector that we don't really talk a lot about, which is that a lot of donors, a lot of people outside of the sector think that nonprofits are not particularly effective. They read press articles about scandals and stuff. There's research that shows that they consistently rate nonprofits as less competent than for-profits and so forth. I think the big thing that I've learned doing this work now for about 5 years is that that's just definitely not true. Like we've looked at about 1,100 nonprofits now. They cover about 8 causes, 20 different types of programs, and about 85% of them, a little more than that, are cost effective. They're cheap. They're making good use of their resources, and so I think that it's not quite what we're trying to do at Charity Navigator or sort of the specific goal here, but I think it's a broader message that should be shared more widely. That the answer is not when somebody says, "Oh, but nonprofits are just going to waste your money." The answer is not, "Oh, but they're trying to do good work." The answer is that they're not wasting your money unless you're choosing like very poorly among the available options. That the vast majority are going to take your dollars and actually do something good for somebody's life.
Yeah, and I would add, I think, Elijah, just to echo that point, I think that's absolutely on point. And again, I think getting back to this question of like, how do you as a nonprofit use measurement effectively, not only to increase donor funding, but for your own effectiveness. And I just want to say, I think one of the things I've really come to appreciate over the past years at Evidence Action is how powerful measurement can be as a way to dynamically improve programs. I will say that I've come from a lot of nonprofits where M&E was sort of treated as the dusty, back end function, almost more of an audit role. And I think here what we do is we tend to use measurement to dynamically improve the program. So, I talked about dispensers for safe water and the fact that it was low cost and it's high usage. but that wasn't the case. And I think it was Victoria who'd said how dynamic these programs are. You know, at the program outset, we had these dispensers for safe water, dispensers sitting in villages. They were little, they were heavy to transport, they were expensive, they were breaking down. But because we were measuring breakdowns in usage, we caught that. We saw that the breakdowns were happening. We saw that they really reduced usage, and we ended up experimenting with a bunch of changes. And we ultimately, I don't know what version of the dispenser we're on now, multiple versions later, you know, we have a very inexpensive plastic bucket with a precision valve. It's operating at 90% functionality and reduced the cost of the dispenser by 40%. And we have other examples on the delivery side where we shifted from vans to distributing chlorine at health centers to schools, and then ultimately shifted to motorcycles, which reduced the delivery cost by 75%. And we did all of that because we were identifying these simple, actionable metrics that underlied basically the fundamentals that Elijah, I think, laid out very elegantly. And so I think it's more, I think what I've learned is identifying and really investing strategic leadership time in saying, what are our core program metrics that we want to hang our hat on and that we will use to dynamically improve performance, and then thinking about how do we action those has been really a powerful piece for me. And I think I keep coming back to it because in the push for impact, I want us to be clear that it's the impact for the beneficiaries. And then bringing along funders is a very positive corollary.
Well, I mean, all great things, all great things. I wish that we would have actually more time to just dive into this because there's a treasure trove of information. For those who joined us earlier and came in a little bit towards the beginning, we did ask a question on the webinar, and here are the results. So the question was, nonprofit professionals, how do you currently showcase your impact to potential and current donors? A whopping 77% of you said storytelling and marketing. That's fantastic. Now, obviously, we haven't drilled down into the types of marketing, but I just think it's terrific to see so many of you who are actually doing this. And obviously, we would encourage you to continue to do this. That's great. So we're going to move to our last question, unfortunately, because we're getting close to our time. So for everyone, if you wanted those who are our audience today to take away one thing, what would that one thing be? What's the one takeaway? Who would like to jump in? Stephen?
Sure. I think the word I'd use that came to mind was evolve, and maybe it was triggered by Kanika's story of being agile and responsive to what's happening on the ground and having processes to do that. Unfortunately, our program planning cycles, our grant cycles sort of work in these longer time horizon cadences. But in terms of implementing and using the data that you're collecting in close to real time as possible to be making shifts so that you're improving, that really is the point of evolution, the point that I would stress in the evolution that needs to happen. Now, we've got to have better tools to do that. We've got to have data visualization tools. It's got to be easier for sure. But I think that's really, it's something that we're doing at Charity Navigator. We're really shifting from a annual rating cycle to an ongoing versioned rating, and it's just the reality of the world and how we're shifting that. A year from, if I evaluate you based on November of 2019 in the previous year, and I evaluate the year hence, it's completely different, right? Completely. And so, and everyone's adapted, everyone's made changes. And so, you know, this time that we're living in has, I hope, gotten us to the point where we realize that adaptation and evolution on a quicker cycle is really what needs to happen, and that getting good impact data and program monitoring evaluation data can drive that.
Just to remind our audience that we will be going through a few, not very many, unfortunately, a few questions that came in during the course of our webinar today. So if you have any last questions that you think you want to squeeze in, we will try to answer as many as we can. Victoria, what's the one thing that you want someone to take away from today's webinar?
Measure for yourself and figure out a way to make a simple connection to donors or cross that chasm with your measurement. And, you know, test it yourself. Help add to the evidence of how this shifts donor behavior. Send out emails and have some have impact statements and others not, and see what happens. You know, run your own tests and see what your donors care about the most.
Point well taken. Kanika?
I think that, you know, measuring and optimizing impact, it's hard, it's messy. Sometimes you're going to have to make tough decisions like exiting programs or geographies that you really don't want to, but it's central to what we as nonprofit leaders do to achieve our missions. And so just to say that I'm encouraged about a sector where it's just increasingly placed and recognized at the heart of what we do. So grateful to Charity Navigator and Gates Foundation and others for moving this forward.
And last but not least, Elijah, what's that one takeaway?
I'll just end with a plug. Go to impact.charitynavigator.org, share your data. We'll see if we can turn it into an impact statement for you to use.
All right. Okay. So thank you. Thank you so very much. Our panelists really got people thinking. Lots of information that we didn't get to cover more deeply today. We do have a few questions that we're going to kind of quickly go through, and if we don't get to your questions, forgive us. There's so many that came through during the course of this. So one question was, how do you measure impact fairly across organizations, across causes? So how do you measure impact fairly for organizations across cause areas? Anyone want to jump in? Stephen, maybe?
Well, you know, I think Elijah laid out the methodology in terms of what we're looking for, and you know, very specifically within the Encompass rating system. So I'll take it that way. Maybe someone wants to take a broader approach, but very specifically, you know, it's on a 0 to 100 point scale, the rating system, and so sort of within different domains or within different service delivery areas, you're going to be looking at a scoring that's on a 0 to 100%, 0 to 100 scale, and you know, a donor is going to be able to you know, use the site to decipher, you know, between organizations on that scale. So really, it's the numbers that are connecting, or the connective tissue across causes. The methodology addresses those cause areas or those service delivery areas separately. The rating itself brings it together.
Okay. We have another question. So could you share your thoughts when you're demonstrating impact, when programs are more likely to prevent an outcome? And so the person gives an example: preventing eviction versus outcomes like increased income or affordable housing. Obviously, that's very specific to that category. I don't know if anyone can answer that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's probably a lot of it will depend on the nuance of the metric itself. For something like, for something like eviction rates, you might want to look at time in housing. So what's retention rate at 6 months, what's retention rate at 12 months, what's retention rate at 24 months? Because, I think the problem with looking at the eviction rate in the context of impact statements, not in general, but just in the context of this analysis, is that the analysis typically centers around a participant's experience. And really what you're doing when you're looking at an eviction rate is you're looking at I don't know if failure is the right word, but you're looking at something that you're not looking at the entirety of the participants' outcomes, you're looking at an outlier. So it's a very useful tool for understanding your success, and it might be the right one, but it might require a little bit of modification or of conversion to get to an impact statement for fundraising. But to Victoria's point, right, like the primary goal shouldn't be to, well, I don't know, everybody needs to raise money to survive. So you got to do that. But really, if it's a useful tool for organizing and improving your internal work, then stick with the number you have.
Right. We have a question, and it's a question that actually comes through to Charity Navigator fairly often. And so this one will be for you, Stephen. For nonprofits that have not historically electronically filed their IRS Form 990, what are the plans for some sort of tool or to manually upload the data so that finance and accountability, that beacon can be awarded?
Yeah,
If you're not filing your 990s electronically, is there anything coming?
Super briefly, first of all, start, because it's going to become a requirement. So start e-filing 990s. If the sooner the better. They may have relaxed it based on the pandemic, but that's coming. So just get yourself prepared for it. Secondly, we're building a nonprofit portal that will allow organizations to submit data to us, including that kind of data. So sometime early next year, we anticipate having a MVP or a first version of that, and we'll go from there. So we will, it's very much our intention to enable that and enable organizations to engage with us in that way.
So the bottom line is, unfortunately, if you are not e-filing, you're going to have to start e-filing. We have another question. Given the impact measurement has been historically lacking, how do organizations benchmark their impact against others to know whether or not it's good and if they're on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk to that briefly. We actually typically don't benchmark nonprofits against other nonprofits. We benchmark them against some sort of objective measure of what it costs to achieve that outcome or that output in that particular place and time. And I think that, we struggle with this a lot, and it's very easy to like throw up a bell curve or like put people on a scale and and do that sort of comparative analysis. And there might be some value in doing it, but the reality is that everybody is serving a different community. They're serving them a different way, and so what we're trying to figure out is, can we, the donors are giving to that person, that organization for that reason. Can we tell them, what that organization is doing? So I guess the point being, like, I wouldn't worry too much about comparison. I mean, it is an interesting talking point, and there's data out there that would theoretically enable that analysis to be done. But I don't think that I think we can reach the conclusions about whether a group is like making good use of money, if it's cost effective and so forth, without necessarily adding that comparative element.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, I think we find that it's oftentimes that an intervention itself is very cost effective, and whether you have a 20% overhead or a 40% overhead, whether you're sort of those changes are in some senses a little more marginal, and it's driven primarily by the intervention itself and oftentimes the geography.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are at the end, but I just 1 more minute. I just want to thank our esteemed panelists, Kanika, Bahl, Victoria, Vrana, Stephen Rockwell, and Elijah Goldberg. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. Please, or to our audience, please visit your rating page to download your rating toolkit. So jump on charitynavigator.org and search for your organization and download your rating kit. Please visit impact.charitynavigator.org, yet another plug. What will happen after the close of this webinar, we will have a short survey that we will send out, and we would appreciate feedback on the event. And last but not least, what's important and upcoming in the future, in October 2019, Charity Navigator and Candid announced How We Listen. And some of you may be familiar with How We Listen. And it's a brief survey that invites nonprofits to share details about their feedback practices and access resources to improve how they listen and respond to feedback. So in early of 2021, which is around the corner, Charity Navigator plans to leverage this data for the initial version of our community and culture beacon. So therefore, we ask that you please share your feedback practices at guidestar.org/update. Again, that's guidestar.org/update. So thank you again. We really appreciate you joining us. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.